This is the Fantasy Football Unlimited Podcast with your host, Kevin Murray.
Welcome to the Fantasy Football Unlimited Podcast. On this episode, we have a special guest. He's been a writer for the Fantasy Footballers, and he played a significant role at FantasyPros prior to starting the Fantasy Playbook. He is now the Fantasy Football Content Director at Pro Football Network. It's Kyle Yates. Thrilled to have you on, Kyle.
Thanks so much for having me. It is it's fun to take a step back from the absolute chaos that is like leading up to the NFL season and trying to make sure everything's in place and all this sort of stuff. Just to kind of just take a step back and just kind of pause and breathe for a second and have a fun conversation. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's obviously the calm before the storm, right?
Right.
So you surged onto the fantasy football scene a handful of years ago. Take me back to when you first discovered fantasy football and when you first decided to start making content.
Yeah, so it's so funny, like people, that I've talked to, and I'm even conducting an interview search currently for bringing on a full-time fantasy analyst into my team at Pro Football Network, and was interviewing someone, and they were like, I've been playing fantasy football since I was, since 1992. And I was like, it's 2 years before I was born. Like, these guys have been playing fantasy football for so long. I grew up a massive hockey fan, so I didn't even really pay attention much to football at all growing up until I got to college. So my first year playing fantasy football was Odell Beckham Jr.'s rookie season, and I won the championship because of Odell Beckham Jr. So my first year ever playing fantasy football, won it because of that dominant stretch that he had towards the, into the fantasy playoffs there. So yeah, I was just, kind of late onto the scene there playing fantasy football, but instantly fell in love with it. It was something that, just loved the strategy behind it, the research that went into it, and it quickly kind of grew from, I had no aspirations whatsoever to do this as a full-time career. This was really something that I was like, I enjoy doing and I love getting to play it, but and I'll do this little podcast on the side, or I'll do this thing and I'll start writing, and the love and for the NFL and fantasy football kind of grew over time, where I started to take on these little writing jobs here or there, and to start to kind of put my thoughts out there and refine my my voice in the fantasy football industry. And yeah, you mentioned like surging onto the scene. Like, it really was. It was a situation where I did not expect things to move as quickly as they did, but things have certainly lined up the way that they have for a reason. So I'm happy to be here. That's
awesome. And you originally started the Fantasy Football Life podcast. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was actually really funny on my Facebook memories. It came up yesterday, 6 years ago today. I started up this That Fantasy Football Life podcast was this name of this podcast that I came up with, and listening back to, I found the tapes to it, like the MP3s to it, a couple years ago, and I listened back to it, and I just had both my hands over my eyes the entire time. It was like, oh, this is absolutely terrible. There's no podcasting presence whatsoever. The advice that I was spitting out was just absolutely horrific. I think I was hyping up Adam Shaheen as a breakout tight end that year, or something like that. I was like, oh no, don't do that. But yeah, so that was kind of my first sort of dipping the toes in the water into the fantasy football podcasting space. And then I ended up writing for Chicago-based sports website Sports Mockery. I ended up writing for them, doing some NFL draft, and Dynasty is my background, like NFL draft. I absolutely love that. So ended up doing some writing for them on the side, and that's kind of what built up my portfolio for the fantasy footballers to be able to take a shot on me.
That's amazing. And then you ended up with that incredible opportunity at FantasyPros. How was your experience there?
Absolutely loved it. I owe them pretty much everything, right? They took an absolute shot on me for someone who really did not have much, podcasting chops, or, was very, very unproven. They absolutely took a shot on me, and I owe everything that's happened up to this point. I've learned a ton from the people that are there, an absolutely phenomenal group of people. And of course, getting to work alongside Mike Tagliere, and him becoming one of my best friends was absolutely just a dream come true. And then, being able to, I didn't know Dan Harris at all when I first started. And then for Dan to become one of my best friends as well. And for the three of us, I feel like at that time where Dan, Tags, and I were doing the FantasyPros Football Podcast together, that was one of the, if not the best fantasy football podcast out there. Just I remember telling them I would do a podcast I would be on air for 4 hours each day, 4 or 5 hours each day, if that meant that I got to do that with you guys. It didn't matter. Time flew by. It was a ton of fun. So yeah, it was definitely a situation where I absolutely loved every second of it.
It was, truly a special podcast, and obviously everyone, their hearts were torn to pieces when Tags passed, and so we always knew, I was very aware of how much he meant to you, and so it was definitely a special podcast, a special thing you guys did together for sure. Yeah. So you ended up making the leap to branch out on your own, starting the Fantasy Playbook. What went into that decision?
Yeah, it was kind of a situation where obviously Tags had passed, and then Dan had made the decision to go back to his previous career that he joined before he became the editor-in-chief at Fantasy Pros. And so that was a situation where I was kind of like, I needed mentally that fresh start. I needed that sort of fresh start someplace else where there had been a lot that had happened, especially over that last 6 months there at Fantasy Pros. So even though it was a very tough decision, it was something where I kind of looked at the landscape, looked at what other content creators were doing, and I kind of just had this decision of, I wonder if I can do that too. I wonder if this can be something where I can do this full time. I felt like this was sort of that next step for me to take. And so I ended up stepping out all in, what was that, February of 2022. Stepped out, and launched the Fantasy Playbook. And so all of last season, I ended up running my own company, and finding out that is a completely different animal than, or completely different beast than just sitting down and, and being able to create content day in and day out. You got to worry about absolutely everything. But what it did is it really taught me all these other skill sets. Like, I had some background in graphic design and video editing. I'd done some of those responsibilities in previous jobs that I've had, but that was something where it really just helped me refine those skills and to be able to kind of take that to the next level, because I had to do that every single day. It taught me the marketing side of the business. It taught me, partnerships and sponsorships and, that sort of thing as well. So it really, really took me from just this person who was a fantasy analyst and could fulfill the duties of that job, but then really expanded my horizon and my, the range of what I can do, which has teed me up perfectly to, occupy this position that I have now at Pro Football Network.
That's awesome. Now, so you are now the fantasy football content director at Pro Football Network. Let's talk about everything that's going on over there. Tell me about your role at PFN.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, Pro Football Network has just experienced a very similar meteoric rise over the past several years. It's a phenomenal company filled with phenomenal people, and we're really in a position where we're excited to kind of take everything that we've learned in previous seasons and get the right people in the right seats of the bus. Right? That's like my degree is in leadership. My college degree is in leadership, and so this is something where you talk about the right people in the right seats of the bus and putting them into the positions where they can be the most successful. And I think that we're absolutely doing that. Where we just brought on Kyle Soppe formerly of ESPN, which is it's been awesome to get to know him. He's on my team here, and so we're working closely side by side to help shape the content plan for this season. And then we've got a few other people that are just absolutely phenomenal at what they do. So I'm really, really excited for what we're going to be able to do here this year and helping build off of the foundation that people have laid in previous seasons to then help people dominate their fantasy football leagues this year. So I'm incredibly excited about the direction that the fantasy department is going at Pro Football Network.
That's cool. Yeah. So all the shout outs and the tributes to Kyle Soppe were really cool. Obviously some big impacts he had on the ESPN team. So it was really cool to see him added over there with you. So tell me more about the fantasy department, some of the content that's coming out here this next year.
Yeah, so I think the big thing that, is worth mentioning, we're really taking everything that we've kind of done. I've mentioned this a couple times, but taking everything that we've done and just kind of refining it and making sure that it's sculpted the way that people want it to be like, right? But the big thing is that Pro Football Network in the past really hasn't had a well-established podcast, hasn't really had a well-established YouTube platform or anything like that. So my YouTube channel that I had built up the previous year with the Fantasy Playbook has now been brought underneath the Pro Football Network umbrella. And then we're launching a podcast here later on this month. This is the first time that I've really talked about that with anyone outside of the company. So breaking news here on the platform. But yeah, we're excited to get this underway. And with the incredible people that I've gotten to know over my time in the industry, bringing those voices onto the podcast. Like, I'm just incredibly excited to bring those voices in and help become part of people's daily routine to help them, win a fantasy football championship this year. So I would say probably the biggest thing to like be on the lookout for at Pro Football Network will be the launch of our PFN Fantasy Football Podcast that'll be coming here very, very soon.
That's awesome. Great to break that news. So now you obviously have had a lot of unique experiences thus far in your career. So what advice do you have for aspiring fantasy football analysts and people that are looking to get more involved in the space?
Yeah, so it's really funny because, I've gone through and I've kind of given advice to people that, I've kind of asked that very similar question in years past, but I have a different perspective on it even now, right? Being on the other side of making a decision on who to hire. So I would say like really the biggest thing is that you need to be well-rounded as a content creator. For a lot of companies out there, you are going to need to wear multiple different hats within the department. You need to be well-rounded from an audio and video perspective. So get those podcasting reps under your belt, get video experience, build up that portfolio, but also be really, really, have that portfolio as a writer as well, being able to know that you can deliver at a high level. What you're asked to do from a writing perspective as well is crucial. So I see a lot of people out there that are very one-dimensional, if that makes sense. Like you can do one thing really, really well, but they just don't dip their toes into the writing water, right? Or they are only a writer, but they don't do any sort of audio video stuff on the side. And as I went through a job hiring process that had 450 applicants or something like that, right? And I had to search through all of them. It was very, very difficult to find people that could stand out from the crowd. And if you aren't able to do all of those different facets, you're not going to stand out from the crowd and from everyone else that's sort of applying for a very, very coveted position. There's not many full-time fantasy analyst positions in the industry. So for what companies are looking for, you really, really need to have that well-rounded skill set. So I would say just continue to build that up. And if I were to give advice on which one to go after, I would say go after writing. If you're thinking like audio and video is where I need to be the most, well-versed and, have that skill set, I would actually point you more towards writing because that's what companies are more looking for now, to be able, you need to have that audio and video, but like for the easy revenue to be able to point to, like that's what companies are looking for is that revenue from a writing perspective. So I would say that would typically be what I would point people towards now too, is build up and make sure that you are a solid writer.
That's great. Great advice for sure. Now for me, I love the fantasy football league experience. That to me, that's the foundation of the game that everyone loves so much. What to you do you love most about fantasy football?
I think there's a ton of it, right? I talked about it with what drew me into fantasy football from the start was obviously the research, the strategy behind it, but I think that it's mostly the camaraderie, like to be able to have those leagues where, my favorite league that I play in, and I'm in a league right now where, I'm the commissioner of one with like Field Yates, Adam Rank, and, Mike Golick Jr. and like a ton of well-known industry names. And that's not even my favorite league. Like I love those people, don't get me wrong, but that's not even my favorite league. My favorite league to play in is my one with college buddies, right? Like the ones that we've been playing fantasy football together for years. We were doing redraft leagues and we're like, hey, what if we started a dynasty league, and that has suddenly just taken off. And we're doing, I think we're going into year 6 now or something like that, year 5 or 6 of it now. So that's the draw for me, is to be able to have this sort of camaraderie, the inside jokes that come from it. Like that's definitely something that I think is absolutely my favorite part of playing fantasy football.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, to me, again, it's that league experience. So within leagues, there's a lot of ways to make leagues more fun and engaged. Do you have any advice on league engagement or advice on making a live draft fun?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of things that you can do as far as live drafts and to take that sort of experience to the next level. Like getting even something, adding in like a draft board, right? Like just the, to be able to go up and put the stickers on the draft board. Like that's obviously something that not a lot of people think about, but it's a ton of fun to do. I think that what we do for our dynasty rookie draft is like we have a couple of TVs set up, as guys typically do, and then we've got like the draft board on one of them as it's going on, and then we've got highlights that we'll pull up of the player that was just selected, and we'll like play those to add this sort of additional little fun wrinkle to it. But yeah, I think the live draft experience in general is one that is definitely something that you can take into your league and make it a ton more fun, rather than just doing one, on Sleeper or whatever, and no one's interacting with or whatever, everyone's remote. Like being able to pull people in for a live draft experience just makes it a ton more fun in general.
For sure. Now, how about last place punishments? Are there any punishments you've used or things that you've seen that just blow your mind?
So I got asked this question recently online, and they were like, "What's your thought on last place punishments and like going super overboard?" And I was like, I really don't like the ones that are like, you got to get a tattoo or something like that, right? Like, I'm like, I think that's just a little bit too far. Like, this is still just a game of a game. Yes. Like, let's not go too far. But the ones that are the super popular, like the Waffle House, like I love that idea, or the pancakes, and you got to, IHOP or whatever. I love that idea. We've done, for years, we've done like last place will buy the first place person a jersey, right? So there's still like, you get a jersey of the player that helped you win your championship. So that's something where it's definitely not extreme or anything like that. But that's one that you can kind of dip your toes into the water of
Sure.
the last place punishments and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that being able to kind of pull in from your experiences and what you guys, like any inside jokes or stuff like that within your league, to be able to kind of incentivize, hey, I don't want to finish last place, I think are always great ideas.
For sure. Now, Kyle, is there anything we haven't covered yet with PFN, things that you're excited about coming up that you'd like to let us know before we close things out?
For sure. We just launched an Instagram, so I know that a lot of people are on Instagram and looking for fantasy football content. That way, we're creating a ton of custom content that goes out there, so you can find that at PFN Fantasy over on Instagram, so make sure to check that out. But otherwise, on Twitter, PFN Fantasy, the YouTube channel is PFN Fantasy, so I know that this is something where a lot of people may not be super familiar with the brand, but I'm definitely excited for this year and what we're building here with Pro Football Network and the fantasy football department. So anywhere that you can find your fantasy football content, make sure that you're going to PFN Fantasy. And then, of course, the website is profootballnetwork.com.
And where can they find you?
Absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at Kyle Y. Are we still promoting Twitter? I don't know. It's a gray area. I don't know if we're still promoting that. But on Twitter at Kyle Y NFL. And then over on Instagram and Threads, I will throw that in there as well at the Kyle Yates.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for joining me on this episode. Can't wait to see what's ahead for you and PFN in 2023.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast. Until next time, be sure to follow and subscribe to all of FFU's social media accounts for daily content.